Hi everyone, my name is Liz, I read, and welcome to another video. So in this video, I'm going to be reviewing 3 Pride and Prejudice books. One of them I don't have a physical copy of, but I read 3 of them recently and I thought I would do a review. So these Pride and Prejudice books, they're basically retellings or adaptations, and they're 3 very different ways of reading the Pride and Prejudice story. So it was definitely a cross-section in this kind of narrow genre. I actually ended up really liking all of them for different reasons. So let's just get on with the review. So the first book I'm going to talk about is the one I don't own, and it's called Mr. Darcy's Diary by Amanda Grange. And I read this on Hoopla via ebook, and this is basically what it says. It is Mr. Darcy's diary. The author retells the story from Mr. Darcy's perspective through diary entries, and it begins even before the original Pride and Prejudice story. It begins with him actually dealing with the scandal between his sister and Mr. Wickham, and it goes on from there. What was fun about this story is you actually got to see the story through his eyes, through his perspective, and you got to see a glimpse of what possibly his feelings and thoughts were. Obviously during the scandal at the very beginning, when he first is introduced to Elizabeth and the relationship between them. I would say this is actually really accurate when it comes to the Pride and Prejudice story. The author did not leave anything out when it came to the events of the original story, and it was a lot of fun seeing it from his perspective. And it was also really interesting to see his feelings and reactions to other characters, not even just Elizabeth, but his reaction and feelings when it comes to Mr. Bingley and Bingley's sisters, especially Ms. Bingley. It was kind of fun and interesting to see his take on things. There were some really good swoon-worthy moments throughout this story, and this story goes beyond the original story. So it begins even before the events of Pride and Prejudice and after as well. I will say that I found once Darcy and Elizabeth finally got together, which I believe is not a spoiler because we all know the story if you are watching this video. I found when they actually got together, it was a little anticlimactic. There were definitely better scenes previously when it comes to the romance, and so I found when they finally got together, it was a little anticlimactic. And also, like I said, the story continues past the original events of Pride and Prejudice, and I understand why the author did that. People want to see Darcy and Elizabeth as a couple, and I did enjoy it, but I felt it was a little bit long-winded. We saw them get married, we saw them just being together and holding parties and things like that. And it was kind of fun and interesting to see how them being together would impact the other people in their life and how they would deal with those people. But at the same time, I felt it was a little long. Like, I think it went as far as a year into their marriage, and I was finding I was getting bored after a while. So that and them finally getting together, it being anticlimactic, is one of the reasons why I knocked it down to 4-star. And so that's my final rating for this book, is a 4-star rating. Overall, I did really enjoy this one though. Like I said, it was still a really enjoyable reading experience. I enjoyed a lot of the romantic scenes, and I liked seeing the story through Mr. Darcy's eyes. I liked how it was very true to the original. So I do highly recommend this one, especially if you're a big Pride and Prejudice lover. I will say you have to read Pride and Prejudice in order to enjoy this, because otherwise there's really no point in reading it if you don't know the original story. So if you know the original story, then you may want to pick up this one. The next book that I read was Longbourn by Jo Baker, and this story is told through the perspective of the servants. So I would say this is a completely separate story from the original. The original is kind of the backbone of the story. They use the events of Pride and Prejudice in order to tell the story from the servants' perspective. But first and foremost, it is the servants' story, and Elizabeth and the Bennets are supporting characters and not the main characters. There's a total of 4 servants that you follow. You follow Mrs. Hill, who's the main housekeeper, and her husband, Mr. Hill, who is the butler. There's also Sarah, who is ultimately kind of the main character of the story, and she's a maid or additional housekeeper. And then there is Polly, who is a servant girl. Everything changes, their life changes when they bring on a man to become footman, and things that were very mundane before becomes a little bit more interesting when they take on this man. I really enjoyed this because you got to see what it was truly like to be a servant of this time and era, and also not just that, but also of this caliber of a family. Throughout Pride and Prejudice, it's told time and time again how unfortunate Bennet family are compared to other rich families. They're not as well off. When you read the story from the servant's perspective, it changes your perception about that. You come to realize that the Bennet family is actually well off. Yes, and compared to other rich families, they are not. But the fact that they can hold a staff themselves and the people of the family don't have to do the things that the servants have to do goes to show that the Bennet family is quite well off, and it changes your perspective on those original characters. You got to see what it actually was like to be a servant in that time and era, and how hard work it was and how mundane their life was. These people wake up early in the morning to start the fire and cook the family their food and attend to the women and men of the house, and they work extremely hard. And the women upstairs, if they want something from the store, the servant has to drop everything they're doing and walk across the field just to meet the demands of the people of the house. And they work from morning to dusk, and it's extremely hard, mundane, but extremely back-breaking work. And it was definitely interesting to see this kind of lifestyle and really appreciate what we have now in modern day society. I think we can forget how hard life was back in the day, and how by having all these conveniences, we've definitely elevated the lower class. Of course, we still have problems in our own society when it comes to the class system, but the fact that the lower class can have a better life is quite amazing. Like I said, the author does an amazing job of changing your perspective when it comes to the original characters of Pride and Prejudice. The author changes your perspective on Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth and Jane, Mr. Bingley, and even Mr. Darcy. Just with the type of storytelling that the author does, it changes your view on these characters and kind of twists the original story to make you think. I will say you don't have to read the original story to enjoy this one, but I do highly recommend it just so you can compare and contrast and see how the author changed their perspective when it comes to the characters of the original story. I think that's a big element of the story, is changing your view on things and seeing how life probably was actually like and not how we view the original. Life in this day and age for servants was not a good life. It was a very hard life. So in the end, I decided to give this a 4-star. There were some parts that were a little boring, and there were some flashbacks which I wasn't expecting. Still really good, still really interesting, but there were some moments in here that I was a little bored. But overall, I loved this story. I think it's one of my favorite out of the 4. It's definitely an examination on class in that time and era. And like I said over and over again, changes your view on the original story. So if you love Pride and Prejudice and you want to be challenged on your viewpoints on the original story, definitely pick this one up. And the last one is Confessions of a Jane Austen Addict by Vera Rigler. This is more of a fluffy, rompy, chick lit version. I would definitely say this is the furthest away from a Pride and Prejudice or Jane Austen retelling, because we follow Courtney Stone in this novel, and what happens is, right off the bat, right away, Courtney wakes up in another body in Regency, England. And it's about her navigating this new world and trying to find her way back home to modern day society. She's just thrust into this body. She doesn't know why. And she's trying to adjust to living in that era where there's bedpans and doctors with bad medical practices and manners that she's not familiar with. And along the way, of course, there is a romance in here as well. Like I said, this is a very campy story, kind of rompish, where the main character is trying to navigate this world that she has no familiarity with. Even though she loves reading Jane Austen, she is unfamiliar of what it actually was like to live in that era. I found that I really did sympathize with this character because I myself wouldn't know how to navigate that world. Even though I like Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen stories, I wouldn't know what it'd be like to live in that era. Just because you love these stories doesn't necessarily mean that translate well to living in that era. I've read criticisms about that they felt this person wasn't a really good Jane Austen addict, but I personally was able to sympathize with the character. There was a romance in here that I did really enjoy, and overall I really found that I enjoyed myself. The reason I decided to give this a 4-star rating, and the reason why I did, is the magic part of the story didn't make any sense to me. I think I understood it, but I think I also don't. And it didn't really deter me from enjoying this novel. I wasn't even frustrated. It was just poor planning, I think, on the author's part. She had to find a way to make this story sound reasonable, I guess. She had to explain why this person was waking up in this body and living out this life. And I think she did a poor job of explaining it. But it didn't bother me because the main point of the story isn't the magic or explaining why she was in this body. The main point of the story was a girl waking up and trying to navigate that era and finding love along the way. That's the main point of the story. I don't care that the explanation was bad. And there were some good moments in here when it comes to the romance that I really enjoyed. This is a 2-parter. This is a second book that I do plan to read where you're reading from Jane's perspective. So that's the girl from Regency, England. She wakes up in Courtney's body and you read it from her perspective. So I do plan to pick that up at some time. I still really enjoyed this. Is this a great piece of literature? No, but it's good chick lit if you like Jane Austen novels. And one point I want to make is you do not need to read any Jane Austen novels to enjoy this. If you like Regency romance novels, then you may like this as well, but you don't need to know pretty much anything about Jane Austen to enjoy this one. So those are my reviews for Pride and Prejudice retellings. I hope you guys liked this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe if you have not done so. And you know what, guys? I want you to keep reading. Bye.